Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to TESOL 2250 again. And I'm going to talk today a little bit more about aspect. Particularly, I'm going to talk about participles and how they relate to aspect, as I was discussing in my videos last week. So we have started looking at a couple of different features of verb status. Remember that verb status, at a minimum, consists of tense. Every verb, or main verb as we're calling it, is going to have tense. Now, if there are auxiliaries, it may also have aspect. And certain auxiliaries will also give it mood too. But we need to clarify a few things about participles before we move on to mood. So far we've discussed two different types of verbs. We have what I'm calling your typical verbs, and these are, what we would say are kind of semantically meaningful. They have a certain amount of content to them. So we can think of an example like run or think or give, right? We can imagine the actions of each of these verbs, and so they're meaningful to us. And then you have auxiliary verbs. Now, these are function words, and they don't really have as much meaning. It's hard to understand what they mean when they're in context with another verb. So your auxiliary verbs consist of the helping verbs have and be, which we saw gives us perfect aspect. They also, auxiliary verbs can also include modal auxiliaries. These are words like can, should, shall, ought to, things like that. Now, these auxiliary verbs are called modal auxiliaries. They're also just another type of auxiliaries, okay? So you got your typical auxiliary, you got your typical verb, and you got your auxiliary verb. So last class, I talked a little bit about aspect. Remember that we get aspect only when we have auxiliary have and auxiliary be. Remember that auxiliary have indicates perfect aspect, meaning that the action is completed. So the example that we had was my dad has cooked the turkey already, or my dad had cooked the turkey already. This auxiliary have demonstrates perfect aspect, and then it has to be followed by a verb in a participle form. Now, I'm being intentionally vague about the name of this type of participle for right now. And that is because the name gets a little bit confusing to folks. So I'm just calling it a participle form. This is a non-finite form of the verb. It has no tense. The auxiliary verb, have, is carrying the tense. Okay, so we have this participle form. It looks kind of like past tense, but we know it does not have tense. Now, we get progressive aspect when we have auxiliary be. And this means that we're focusing on the ongoing nature of the verb. There's no stop point indicated. So my dad is cooking the turkey right now. My dad was cooking the turkey. These are examples of auxiliary be plus this verb in ing form. So once again, we get some version of be, and that demonstrates progressive aspect. That is, that the action is ongoing. And then you get this verb with ing. This is yet another participle form, another non-finite form of the verb cook. So again, I'm being very, very vague about the name of these participles because the names are a little bit confusing. Okay, so that just summarizes what I just said. Auxiliary have indicates perfect aspect. Auxiliary be indicates progressive aspect. The verb that immediately follows each of these auxiliaries is in some kind of participle form, a type of non-finite verb form. So let's define these participles a little bit further. Now, let's take these two sentences. My dad has cooked the turkey already, and my dad had cooked the turkey already. So we got cooked and cooked. Now, cooked in both instances is what we call a past participle. That's the name of it. And you might say, well, that's strange because I thought you said that there's no tense on cooked. Yeah, I said that 3 times. There's no tense on cooked. It's a non-finite form. No, there's no tense. But why on earth do they call it a past participle? It doesn't have past tense. In fact, if we look at the auxiliary in the first example, we know that that's present tense. Okay, so there's a little bit of incongruity with the nomenclature, with the names that we use for these things. Now let's come over here and look at these 2 examples. My dad is cooking the turkey right now, and my dad was cooking the turkey. Well, cooking in both instances is what we call a present participle. Now this is strange, okay? Because again, I said that cooking, that this ing does not have any tense, and yet we're calling it a present participle. And furthermore, if we look at the auxiliary verb for each one, is, well, that seems to be in present, but was is not, it's past. So why on earth do we call these things a past participle and a present participle respectively when they're not supposed to have tense? Okay, the answer to that question comes from Latin. You see, the word participle comes from the Latin word participium, which means to partake or to share. And it's named like this because Latin participles share some of the same forms for nouns and verbs, and English is similar. So let's take, for example, a very simple past tense form. I smoked. I smoked is simple past. Now let's look at the past participle. I have smoked. Now we'll notice that in both instances, we use the exact same form. It's spelled the same way and everything. So what we're saying here is the participle mimics the past tense form. It uses the same form. In other words, it shares the same form. Okay? That's why it's called a past participle. All we're doing is saying that, hey, this word over here, it shares the same form as past tense. It's not past tense, but it shares the same form. Okay? So that's why it's called a past participle, because in many instances, it matches the past tense. Now, in some instances, as we've seen, we have some irregular verbs. It doesn't always match the past tense perfectly. Now, same thing we can see over here. We packed our bags and we had packed our bags. Again, packed and packed, they share the same form as the past tense. That's the only reason why we call it a past participle. And I realize that makes things a little bit confusing. This is especially going to be confusing because we're going to start adding participles onto our trees when we're in class, in our next class. And so you have to remember, past participle does not mean past tense. If they could have called it participle 1 and participle 2, that would have made much more sense, but they didn't, okay? So just ignore that past or that present. It doesn't have anything to do with tense. Okay. So let's look at another example with the present participle. Now, here again, I have the sentence, I am smoking, okay? Present progressive. Now I can also say I was smoking in this case. And we're using this ing form. But when you think about it, how do we express the simple present? We can't just say I smoke, because that means more like I do it habitually, right? And if I want to talk about something that's actually happening right here, right now, I have to use I am smoking. I have to use the auxiliary be plus a verb in ing. So we call this a present participle form because it is the way that we express the actual present. So it shares a form with the actual present and how we express the actual present. And this is why we call this a present participle form. So we don't actually use the simple present to express what we're actually doing in the simple present. This is the only way we can express that notion. Okay, same thing applies here though. Present participles are not present tense. They're always non-finite. So again, I wanted to focus on this because these terms tend to get a little bit confusing for folks, especially as we start adding them to our tree diagrams. Okay. So again, here's just kind of a simple summary of what I was discussing before. Auxiliary have indicates perfect aspect. The action is completed. The following verb form is in a past participle form. So the example I have is I have eaten. So notice if we have auxiliary have, it's going to force eat to appear in a different form. And in particular, it's what we call the past participle form. So I always say that auxiliary verbs are like bad girlfriends. They steal your tense from you, and they force you to change into something you're not. That's exactly what the auxiliary verb does to the verb after it. It steals the tense, and it forces that verb to change into a different form, a form with no tense anymore. Okay? So we have another bad girlfriend over here, and that is auxiliary be. You add auxiliary be to something, it steals the tense from that verb, and then forces it to change into a different form, namely the present participle form. So when we're talking about form, we're talking about the shape of a word. What suffixes does it have? Does it have this en suffix? Does it have an ed suffix that looks like past tense? Does it have an ing suffix? So forms would be things like eat, eaten, eating. These are all different forms of the verb eat. Now, this is distinct from aspect. Aspect is talking more about the nature of the verb. In other words, are we focusing on the endpoint or the ongoing nature of the verb? So aspects, you only get aspect when you have the auxiliary verb have and be. So taken together, have eaten gives you perfect aspect. Am eating gives you progressive aspect. And again, we're going to note the different forms of eat in both instances. So there will be another form that we're going to see. So far, we've seen past participle form after auxiliary have, present participle form after auxiliary be. We're going to see another form after modal auxiliaries and auxiliary do, which is called infinitival form. But we're going to get to that more next week. For now, just take a minute and pause the video. I want you to label the forms of each of the verbs that you see in number 1, 2, and 3 down here that are in blue. Now, look at the verb that comes before it to determine what form each of these verbs is in. So pause the video at this time and figure that out. Okay, so you've paused the video. Now let's look at this first sentence. Number 1 says, I have played the clarinet for 30 years. Okay, so I need to look at this and I say, okay, I'm looking for the form. Now, form is not aspect. I'm looking for the form of this verb, played. Now, I may be keen to note that this kind of looks like past tense. Okay. Well, maybe it's a past participle. Well, I need to check to make sure. And I check by looking to see if I have auxiliary have before it. And sure enough, I do. So as I said before, as we add auxiliary verbs, this is a good place for you to read from left to right as you're doing your tree diagrams. Because the only way you're going to know what form something is in is if you're looking at the auxiliary verb before it, if it has a verb. So I see auxiliary have, so I know that play has to be in a past participle form. That's the only thing that can follow auxiliary have. And sure enough, it looks like past. So it's a past participle. Okay, number 2. Terry is writing a novel. Now in this case, I see this ing. Now, ing is a dead giveaway that you have a present participle. They're always ing. They always end in ing. But nevertheless, we want to check. So we look and we notice we have is, but it's not main verb be. Okay, this is a form of be, but it's not main verb be, because there's another verb that comes after it, namely write. So I have auxiliary be, and I have write, in this case, writing. So I can safely conclude that writing is a present participle form of the verb write. Now, number 3 is a little bit more tricky, but the rule just applies 2 different times, 2 different ways. So, okay, we're trying to find the forms of each verb here in blue, and we have been and waiting. Well, okay, what I would recommend you do is you start with waiting, start with the last verb, and then look immediately to the verb right before it. Look to the left. So we're going to read left to right. Been waiting. Okay. Well, been, that seems to be a form of be. It's not a form of be we see very often or we associate with this very often, but it is a form of be. Okay. So if I have any form of auxiliary be, and I know it's an auxiliary because there's another verb, wait, that comes after it. So if I have any form of auxiliary be, and then I have a verb after it, that means that waiting must be a present participle, because only a present participle form of a verb can follow auxiliary be. Okay, so now we get to auxiliary be. And we notice it's in this strange form, been. It's not is or was, it's been. Well, let's keep looking to the left. What we see is we have auxiliary have. Okay. Well, if we have auxiliary have, then that means the form of the verb after it, in this case, it's another auxiliary. The form of this verb must be in what form? Past participle form. And sure enough, been is in past participle form. It's the past participle form of be. And you can see this, we never really think of it because there's a pronunciation change, but we can see this borne out in other verbs that are kind of similar. For example, I have spoken, I have written a letter, I have eaten. Notice all of these verbs end in en. Well, so does bein. And that's not how we pronounce it. But that's exactly what's going on. Much like spoken, we have bein. Now, over time, the pronunciation has shifted so that we can avoid the slowness of this double vowel pronunciation, and we just get a single vowel, bin, as a result. But at one point in time, in older English, Middle English, we used to have the pronunciation of bein for this word, and that's exactly why it's spelled this way, okay? So it is a participle form of be, and specifically the past participle form. So we're going to be doing a lot of this in class and also on your quizzes. I'm going to ask you what's the aspect of things and what's the form. And we need to know the difference. So if you see a question like, what's the form of a verb? We're looking at participles, okay? Your answer should be some kind of participle. Okay, so again, the same note that I am going to include on all the slides this week. Remember that your synthesis report is due October 8th. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all later.